something I have not shared publicly before, which is just after we launched our website last year, we were lampooned. We were taken down by The Baffler, a lovely quarterly magazine of literary criticism that made fun of us for embracing this genre of writing at the intersection of science and trying to improve your life. And they took issue in particular with a photo of our library that had a bunch of wonderful books by some of the brilliant writers we work with. And they said, in a nod to the past, the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, the book that launched our republic on its monotonous romance with the gospel of self-reinvention. And, so lampooning Abe Lincoln and his autobiography, which, by the way, I highly recommend if you haven't read it. It's very short, it's fantastic. We at Helio take a contrarian view to The Baffler, which is that we think that actually there are many things as an American that I've been embarrassed about over the years. Even very recently, I've been embarrassed as an American. But I think the pragmatic application of knowledge to make our lives better is actually, which is a tradition that goes all the way back to the Founding Fathers, is actually one of the great kind of aspects of American culture. So it's our great pleasure to work, and I think we're living in a golden age. The science of positive psychology just emerged as a serious science only in the last 20 years or so, and we have tonight some amazing thinkers and speakers who are participating in, I think, what is the golden age of the intersection of science and applying that to improving our lives and living more meaningful lives. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce you to the person who is going to introduce you to our speakers, which is Michael Countdown.
Thank you very much. Yes, Rufus, real quickly, we at Helio, we do get a lot of books, and we're very interested in this topic of this intersection of science and self-improvement. So some months ago, we got this book called The Happiness Track, How to Apply the Science of Happiness to Accelerate Your Success. And we read it. And that's why we're much happier and more successful than all of you. Because we at Helio read these books and learn them. We read this book by Emma Seppala. And it's an incredible book. Emma is the science director of Stanford University's Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, CARE, and co-director of the Yale College Emotional Intelligence Project at Yale University. So she's legit. So we all got on board, and we were like, everyone at the office was really getting very, very happy and very successful. And then some months later, we got this other book by Emily Esfahani Smith called The Power of Meaning, Crafting a Life That Matters. And that book told us that maybe the target of happiness wasn't exactly the right target. We got very confused because suddenly it seemed that it was about meaning and not about happiness. And we decided the only way to settle this issue was to have a sort of a cage match and sort of a battle to the death between happiness and meaning. And so tonight you're going to witness this epic battle, and we will decide whether happiness or meaning is really what we should all be aiming at. And I'm sure it's not going to be like that. But here they are, Emma and Emily. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rufus and Michael, for having us here tonight. And this is my first time meeting Emily, but I actually met her a couple of years ago when I read an article of hers that went viral on meaning in the Atlantic. How many of you have read that article? Yep. Yeah, of course. It got reposted, and I found myself revisiting it again and again, reposting it over the years, and I felt like I knew Emily. And for those of you who know a little bit about photography, when you take a picture and you admire a picture, it has nothing to do with the actual people in the frame or the objects in the frame, but everything to do with the photographer who caught that particular moment in that particular way. And so when you look at a photograph, you're actually admiring the photographer. And that's how I felt when I read that article, because I felt like whoever wrote that is a very special person with such a depth. And so I'm just really honored to be here with Emily today, and I wanted to start off by asking you, Emily, what led to you writing this book. The story of your background, your family, is so moving, the one you described in your introduction. I thought maybe we'd start with that.
Well, thank you so much, Emma, for the kind words. Emma, like she said, we just met in person today, but we had dinner beforehand, and it was just so clear. I know that Michael was kind of setting up this joke as like a battle between meaning and happiness, but I think Emma and I see the world in very similar ways. So it's so great to be here with you, and thanks for Helio for having us, and to all of you for being here. So you asked about my childhood, and I wrote this book about meaning, and I think that the questions that are really at the center of the book, like how do I lead a meaningful life, what is the meaning of our own lives, they really were planted in me as a result of growing up in a Sufi meeting house in downtown Montreal. So for those of you who may not know, Sufism is a school of mysticism that's associated with Islam. Probably the most famous Sufi is Rumi, the poet, who many of you I'm sure have heard of. The whirling dervishes, also famous Sufis who you've probably heard of. So what it meant to grow up in a Sufi meeting house was that twice a week, Sufis would come over to our home and sit on the floor in a large room, a meditation hall on the main floor of our house. And they would meditate, sitting cross-legged on the ground, repeating a name or an attribute of God silently in their minds as Iranian Sufi classical music played in the background. And it was a very enchanting childhood. There were formal rituals that kind of governed everything that the Sufis did, from the way they shook hands to the way they entered the room and kind of bowed down to kiss the floor by touching their hand to the floor, then to their lips. And the whole point of all of these rituals, from the meditation to the touching the floor like that, was to cause their sense of self to diminish so that they could grow closer to this kind of higher reality that they thought that's where meaning lay. Another part of their practice was loving kindness, which of course is central to many religious systems, from Buddhism to the Judeo-Christian system, and service, of course, as well. And so I think growing up, surrounded by people like this, who were living really meaningful lives and had clear answers to what it meant to lead a meaningful life, stayed with me and left an impression on me. As I got older, I began to wonder, can you lead a meaningful life outside of a spiritual or religious system? If you don't believe in God, if you don't have faith, what are the implications for leading a meaningful life? And that kind of led me to philosophy and eventually to psychology and positive psychology, which is what you write about, and then to this book.
So what would you think, so can you describe in a short way the keys to leading a meaningful life, or at least one of the keys that you described in your book?
So when I set out to write this book, it grew out of that article that I wrote for the Atlantic that you talked about. So at first, the first part of the argument was, well, meaning should be kind of what we're striving for. And then I wanted to know, well, what are the building blocks of a meaningful life? Like, how can we go about leading meaningful lives? And so I kind of did a bunch of research. I interviewed dozens of people. I traveled around the States. I looked at the philosophy, looked at the psychology, and these four themes emerged again and again in the research that I was doing and in the research that I was coming across. And they are what I call the pillars of meaning, or the building blocks of a meaningful life. And they're a sense of belonging, so being in relationships and involved with communities where you feel valued and like you matter, and where you treat others like they're valued and like they matter. The second was purpose, so some kind of stable and far-reaching goal that involves contributing to the world. The third one was storytelling, so how you kind of make sense of your experiences in the world that you're living in. What's the story that you tell about your own life and about who you are? And finally, transcendence, which, these are kind of moments, which were frequent in my childhood among the Sufis, where your kind of sense of self diminishes and you feel connected to something bigger. Often it happens in a religious context, like through prayer or meditation, but people can also experience it in nature, through art, and in other secular ways. So those are what kind of came up again and again for me as the building blocks of a meaningful life.
And did you come across statistics about what percentage of our society feels like they're living a meaningful life versus those who aren't, and the repercussions for that, for well-being and mental health and so forth?
So it's interesting. There was a study from several years ago showing that about, I think it was only 25% of people it was about a quarter of people didn't really have a strong sense of what makes their lives meaningful or what their purpose is. So in America, that would amount to about 100 million people, and there's evidence also that it's similar in other kind of developed countries. And the repercussions for well-being are enormous. People, if they don't have meaning, they're more likely to suffer from depression, have suicidal thoughts, fall prey to kind of drug and alcohol abuse. If they're students or young people, to kind of fall off track academically, to not be motivated. So there's something about meaning. It's it's the why. It's the thing that motivates you and gives you a reason to get up out of bed. And if you don't have it, then you kind of feel adrift and alienated even.
So what's been your personal way of finding meaning in your life?
I think, so I mentioned those 4 pillars, and I think everyone can kind of lean on different pillars to differing degrees. And for me, it's definitely a sense of belonging. So my relationships are very important to me. Like the dinner that we had before this, I feel like that was really powerful, but also kind of just other, the relationships that you have or momentary connections that you have with strangers where you just smile and make eye contact and kind of acknowledge each other as people. There's so many opportunities to kind of build these pillars that we might not even realize. So for me, belonging is a big one. And then transcendence as well, which I know is also important for you. So tell us a little bit about what your sources of meaning are.
For me, definitely on a personal level, it's also a sense of belonging, but a sense of service. And I actually, my entire dissertation research was about this belonging, actually, social connection. And the literature again and again shows us that the greatest predictor of well-being after food and shelter is a positive sense of connection with other people. And yet, in American society, 25% of people say they have no one to speak to about a personal problem. That's 1 in 4 people we meet every day has no one to speak to. So it's really interesting to see. And that sense of social connection not only increases your well-being, but it increases your health and even your longevity. And a powerful way of connection is service. Community service, volunteering, some kind of purpose that's greater than yourself, something that in which you're devoted to a greater cause, like you were saying. And that again has been linked to longevity and faster recovery from disease. In one of my favorite studies that was conducted on hundreds of people that had been through major life stressors, which we know impact longevity if you've had those in your life, they found that a subgroup of those people, it was as if that big stressor had not happened in their life because their longevity was not impacted. And when they looked at the factors why, those were all people who volunteered. In some way, there's something protective about living a life of meaning. There's something protective about living a life beyond me, myself, and I. That involves connection, that involves service. And I think we've all experienced that ourselves. You've had a bad day and feels like everything's going wrong, and all of a sudden someone calls you and something's really going wrong in their life. It's not just spilled coffee, there's something bad, and you're there to help. All of a sudden, your energy shifts, your mental state shifts, you're energized, you're on the ball, you're up again, and you're helping. And I think we've all had that experience, but all of society, everyone who's doing marketing is always just telling us that our road to happiness, what we should be striving for is material. And yet, it's in the relational and it's in the service that we provide to others that we get our greatest sense of purpose and meaning.
What you're saying reminds me of something that one of my professors in grad school, Martin Seligman, told us. So he was an academic psychologist, but he also was a clinical psychologist, and so he saw patients struggling with depression, and he said that when one of his patients came in one day, a college student who was suffering from depression, instead of kind of referring her to a psychiatrist to get some kind of SSRI antidepressant, he suggested that she go out and volunteer for precisely what you're saying. There's something about when you take the focus off yourself and help others that I think it does 2 things. One, it kind of gives you that sense of purpose, like something to do, like you're contributing, and it also cultivates belonging because I think we all need to feel like we have a role to play. in society or in our relationships to others, and if we don't feel like we have that role, then we start to languish a little bit. And so service is a great way to kind of satisfy both of those pillars.
For sure, and it doesn't mean you have to go to Somalia and like feed orphans. You can do it within your profession even. I mean, I see here somebody today who, if you weren't in the room, I wouldn't never have gotten my PhD, because he took me and Michael Morris here in the corner, professor at Columbia Business School, who took me in as like, I was doing my master's in East Asian Studies, and I was like, I want to go into psychology, and he took me in the lab and he was like, this is what you need to do to get into grad school, and he just took me under his wing and helped me. He didn't need to do that. In fact, he tried to dissuade me actually to go to grad school. He's like, why would you do such a thing? But him just taking those few hours out of his life changed my life forever. And I think that those are little things we can all do, which we don't even realize, but the potential, the possibility of making a difference is at our fingertips all the time. And it's tremendously uplifting. It's not at a cost.
I love that point, because I think that there's so much pressure, especially as our kind of traditional and shared sources of meaning disintegrate from our culture, like community and religion, things like that. People put so much pressure on themselves to find meaning in work. And they think, I have to go, eradicate poverty, move to Somalia, do this, do that. When, in fact, if you look at the jobs where people report the highest sense of meaning, they're jobs that are all in the service sector, and we can all adopt a service mindset no matter what we do, because there's a network of people who we're working with, who are helping, like your professor, who was helping you. So, I love this idea that you don't have to radically transform your life in order to find meaning in it. Emma, I wanted to ask you, so one of the things that I love about your book is that you try to redefine success. So you think that there's this kind of harmful idea of success that's driving people forward, and that there should be a new idea of success that kind of motivates us. And I was really moved by this, because I think that if you're kind of a high achieving person, you really can define your identity in terms of success, and this can be both positive and negative. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you think success, our definition of success, should be and shouldn't be?
In the most simple of terms, there's a sense in our society that in order to be successful, we have to somehow sacrifice our happiness, and in some ways just sacrifice ourselves. There's a sense that if you want to achieve, then you need to not sleep, and you need to be really stressed and on a high adrenaline mode all the time and go, go, go. And I think we're in one of the epicenters of that kind of a atmosphere in New York City. And yet, I went to Yale, and then I was at Stanford, and I was in Silicon Valley, and I was in Manhattan, and I saw this happening. And at first I was confused, because I'm from France, and like work is not really valued there the way it is here. But there is basically, people never say, what do you do? They say, where'd you go on your last vacation? I mean, that's more of it's very different. But there's something about the United States which is amazing, which is that it's so creative, and it's so industrious, and it's so productive, and it's extraordinary that way. And yet, what I also witnessed coming from another country here was that people were paying the price with their health, with their well-being, that there was a sense of, I've always got to be working, I can never take time off. And yet, if you look at the data, we've got it wrong. So, and I'll share with you a story. When I was at Stanford, the first year I was there as a graduate student, Stanford University is one of the most beautiful places. You bike down this palm-lined avenue to class, the sun is always shining, these great scholars, and I just felt like I was in heaven. And yet the first year there were 3 suicides on campus. So you could see that, wow, you could be in this incredible place, but people are in their mind in a space which is not at all heavenly. They're in a place of distress. And so we started these Signs of Happiness classes as one of the things that we did there to try and alleviate some of that. And there's a student that came up to one of my colleagues who co-founded the class and said, I got to drop out of this class because it goes against everything I've ever learned. And so my colleague said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, my parents told me I have to be very successful. So when I asked them, how do I know, how do I become very successful? They said, well, you have to work very, very hard. And when she asked, well, how do I know if I'm working hard enough? They said, when you're suffering. And it's shocking, but it's actually a belief and a theory that we have. It's in the air. That's why 50% of Americans across industries are experiencing burnout. Doesn't matter if you're in the medical field or if you're in the nonprofit sector. And there's also a statistic showing that 75% of the American workforce is disengaged at work. 25% of which are actively disengaged, which is, so it's just that something's going on here. Something's not quite working, and I think we all know that. I think who in the room has experienced some feeling of burnout at some point? So, but again, if you look at the data, if we want to be most creative, for example, so creativity is the #1 most valued trait among CEOs for all incoming workforce, above everything else. Because of course you need to innovate, you need to come up with new ideas, you need that kind of task force. So, but how do you become most creative? And again, if you look at the research, we're not at our most creative when we're stressed, hyper-focused, not sleeping, and high on caffeine. Like, we're not. We're at our most creative when we're in the shower. That's the example, right? That's given. Or when we're taking a walk, or it's in that moment when you're just about to go to sleep, and all of a sudden you have an aha moment. Those are the moments. So that's just one very simple example of when you take time off to completely disengage from your work, from your apparatus, from everything that you're constantly doing on your phone or whatever. That's when you get your maximum creativity. It's just one of the many examples of how those things that we're trying to access to maximize our success professionally are best achieved when we have greater balance or taking better care of ourselves and of the people around us. There's so much data on that, I could go on forever.
Yeah, no, I think that this idea of idleness is really important, and it's important for creativity. And I also found in my research that it's really important for leading a meaningful life as well, because there's, two tie-ins. So the first one has to do with purpose. So purpose is kind of, it's psychologists and philosophers have for a long time understood it as you kind of taking the best that's inside of you, so your gifts, your strengths, your talents, and contributing them to the world in some way. But how do you know what your talents are? How do you know what you're interested in? The only way to find out is by giving yourself the time to kind of explore and be curious, to indulge your curiosities, to take that time to just kind of read random books that might take you down certain paths, to follow those, Wikipedia entries to who knows where they take you. And then, my husband does that a lot. I've learned a lot from him though through that. So self-knowledge, that's really important. Knowing yourself, know thyself, the ancient kind of philosophical imperative. And that only can happen if we take the space to disengage and unplug. The other really important way that it plays into meaning is through storytelling. So we can only tell our life stories and reflect on our lives when we have those moments to just sit down and contemplate what happened. And I think for a lot of us, maybe the most resonant experience of doing that is when we're dealing with adversity. These are the experiences where we really have to kind of, it's a glitch in our life story that we have to integrate into the narrative somehow. And the only way we can do that is to take the time to think about it. And it might be painful, and it might take a long time. I interviewed one gentleman who grew up in Havana and was just a child when the Cuban Revolution happened. And the revolution basically upended his entire life. So before the revolution, he was leading a very pampered existence, just doing what young boys do, getting into mischief. Afterwards, he was forced to flee to the United States. He never saw his father again. He lived in kind of extreme poverty, lived in an orphanage for a time, was discriminated against. And yet he eventually realized after decades, and it took him until he was about 50 to kind of make sense of this adversity, that ultimately it shaped him to be who he is today, a more compassionate person, a more purposeful person. And he was only able to do that after kind of deliberately sitting down and writing about his story. So he's a professor, so not worrying about tenure, not worrying about, getting on the right committees and things like that.
Wow, that's amazing. And so what are some tips that you would give to people about how you can just start to engage with your own life with greater meaning?
I think I just want to say this as a preface. I think that when we think about people not having meaning, maybe we think about the person who's despairing and suicidal, but I think that we've all at some point felt unmotivated or wondered, you know, does what I do matter? Like I'm working so hard, I'm spinning my wheels, I feel like I'm not really moving the needle forward. Why am I doing this? I think this is really close to when you get burned out too. It's kind of like part of the same thing. And in those cases, I think what the research shows is that getting into that service mindset, so just very concretely and taking small steps to ask yourself, what's one thing that I can do today to make someone else's life better? And that's an immediate thing that you can do. It can be something as simple as emptying the dishwasher for someone you love so they don't have to do it, or bringing in snacks to the office to kind of elevate the culture. And it's in these little acts that kind of meaning builds and grows. And what I love, and you mentioned the study about how happiness is contagious in your book. It's the same with meaning. When you kind of put meaning out there in the world, it spreads and kind of grows both in your own life and in the lives of those around you. But it lies in these small acts. So asking yourself, how can you contribute? I think another way is just, when it comes to belonging, realizing that belonging is a choice that you can make. So you can invite people to belong and to kind of come into your orbit, or you can choose to reject them. So I interviewed this one guy for my book, this story I tell in it, and his name was Jonathan, and he lived here in New York, up on the Upper West Side, and he has this morning routine where every day he stops at the same corner and buys a newspaper from the same newspaper vendor. And over the years, he and the vendor have kind of developed a little routine where they share a conversation with each other, exchange some kind words, ask each other about their families. It's this small kind of micro moment of belonging that leaves them both feeling elevated when they leave the interaction, because New York is such a large city, it can feel so impersonal. Something like buying a newspaper can be so transactional, and yet here are two people who step outside of that to treat each other like they matter and like they value one another. So they both leave feeling more like their lives are a little bit more enriched because of it. But one day, Jonathan went and he realized he didn't have small bills to pay for the paper, and the vendor didn't have enough change to give him change. So the vendor said, "Oh, don't worry about it. You can pay me back next time, or just don't worry about it at all." But Jonathan insisted on paying the vendor, so he went out of his way and went to a bodega to buy something he didn't need just to pay the vendor. And when he came back and gave the vendor the money and said, "Here you go, just so I don't forget," Jonathan told me that the vendor kind of drew back and was hurt clearly by this. And what he realized is that the vendor was trying to reach out and cultivate this moment of belonging where, almost kind of elevating the level of their relationship to a higher level of intimacy and trust. And Jonathan had rejected that bid. And so both of them left feeling a little more diminished as a result of that. Jonathan realized that he did the wrong thing. The vendor kind of felt hurt by it. And indeed, there's research in psychology that shows that when people are rejected, even in these small ways, these smallest of ways, they actually rate their lives as less meaningful, and they rate life in general as less meaningful. So there's this really tight connection between belonging and meaning. Whereas if we invite others to belong, we rate our lives as more meaningful, and they rate theirs as more meaningful. So fortunately, Jonathan and the vendor were able to restore their relationship. Jonathan came the next day, gave him a cup of tea, and now they still share a conversation with each other, and it's good. But I think that story shows that we can build meaning in these small moments, and that it's in our power to do so.
And what I love about everything that you're saying is that some people think this is sort of a soft topic, or like a utopian view. Oh, okay, a life where you're being nice and stuff, but this is kind of a harsh world, and this is a dog-eat-dog kind of a society. But actually, if you look at the data, for example, on professional success, it's those individuals who are most helpful to their colleagues and most supportive, and who go out of their way to help them, even if it doesn't benefit them, that actually end up doing better in the long run. And it makes sense. Those are the kind of people you want to promote. Those are the kind of people you want to invite to the new company you just joined, and those are the people you want as your colleagues. Those are the people you want to do a favor for because they did something for you. Not to make this an exchangeist kind of an argument at all, but think about, for example, I often think about if there was somebody in your life that did something for you, and it didn't bring them any benefit. For example, Michael. Michael supported me at no benefit to him, right? And now I'm embarrassing him on top of Michael. But it was no benefit to him, right? And yet it brought a lot of benefit to me. But that kind of person, if Michael were to call me one day and be like, "Em, I really need a favor," I would drop everything. I would drop everything. And I think we all have that. Whoever in our life was there for us in a way that they just wanted the best for us, with nothing in exchange, when it turns around, something turns around and they would need something from us, we would do it right away. That's true loyalty. And a lot of companies, for example, think that the way you buy loyalty, you have to buy loyalty, bigger paycheck, more benefits, and so forth. But actually, people prefer to work in a workplace where they have positive social relationships with people, rather than a place where they get paid more. We are social creatures. We're mammals. The greatest, most important thing in our life is those relationships, and those warm, friendly, uplifting relationships are what actually make us thrive psychologically, physically, health-wise, everything.
No, I think that a meaningful life and a happy life aren't always a life of goodness. You can be a kind of a bad person and have meaning and be happy. But I think a life of goodness is a meaningful life and a happy life.
Absolutely true. And one of the ways that psychologists define happiness, they often think about it in two ways. About that they define happiness as often either being hedonic or eudaimonic, the idea being either a life of pleasure, of sensual pleasures, of material pleasures, or eudaimonic, which is a life of meaning, purpose, all the things that Emily is talking about. And one interesting provocative study looked at inflammation levels at the cellular level for people who lived more hedonic lifestyles versus eudaimonic. And they found that people who lived primarily hedonic happiness forms of lifestyle had a much higher level of inflammation, and those who lived a life of meaning, of greater purpose, service, etc., had lower inflammation. Now, that could also be attributed to a hedonic lifestyle, maybe. If you go to a lot of cocktails, maybe you have more inflammation from that. But actually, the research on people who do live a life of service and purpose and meaning shows that it has some kind of protective effect. For example, that study I mentioned earlier about people who had gone through severe life stressors and still had somehow this protective benefit in terms of their longevity.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
I want to go to questions.
Okay.
So is that all right?
Yeah.
All right, so we're about to go to questions. Justin, is there another microphone we could grab? So we can do questions. I forgot to mention earlier, we are live streaming on Facebook, so we do have some questions from Facebook, and also the Power of Meaning and the Happiness Track are available for sale up here if anyone's interested. Okay, we have some pre-orders here going on already. I'll start by, while waiting for the microphone, I'll just ask a question that came from Facebook, which is, well, it's sort of for Emily, but I can broaden it out too. This person asked about the pillar of transcendence, which is one of the pillars of meaning in your book. I'm wondering if you could say more about how to work with the pillar of transcendence, and I would also say to Emma, I know you've written a lot about mindfulness and formal meditation practice in your work, and I wonder if you could say anything about the role of that in happiness.
So the pillar, the word transcend means to kind of go beyond or to step above, and so these are experiences where you kind of you step outside of yourself either a little bit or in a big way and connect to something that's beyond yourself. So I interviewed one person for my book who, during a meditation experience, his sense of self, he said, completely dissolved. He said it was like he realized that the self was just a veil, and when it fell away, he felt connected to everything around him. So that, and in this kind of wellspring of compassion arose in him, and afterwards, and this is a hallmark of a transcendent experience, he was left with kind of a different perspective on the world. So William James, the American psychologist and philosopher, said that these experiences are noetic, which means they impart knowledge on you, and that knowledge is what often kind of gives you that sense of meaning. It's this new way of looking at the world, this new schema that you have, that where you realize, oh, yeah, sure. Hello. And that knowledge just helps you, it changes the way that you view the world. Often your sense of values change. So there's a study of astronauts who went up into space, and when they saw the world from space, they had this transformative experience called the overview effect, where they realized that they couldn't see the borders of the earth. They realized that all of humanity was one, there was no separation. And what the study reported was that their values shifted from very ambitious, kind of self-centered ones to more other-focused ones, meaning-centered values. And so when they came back, they often devoted themselves to kind of humanitarian projects. So those are big examples. And you can find it in smaller ways too, like music, viewing art, things like that. And it's the same effect, but on a smaller scale.
That was beautifully said, and I don't want to diminish the experience or word of transcendence by even attempting to really define it, because I think when you have it, you know it, and you felt it, and it's sometimes beyond words.
Yeah.
But I'll just share a little bit about meditation, and I think that one thing we all experience, and research also shows, is that when we experience a lot of stress, we become self-focused. And so, for example, if you're feeling really stressed and you're walking down the streets of Manhattan and you have a meeting and you have 5 meetings after that and your cell phone's ringing and you've got all these other things happening and your adrenaline's rushing, then your best friend might walk by and you might not notice. Because we get really tunnel vision, and maybe that's something that it was good for our ancestors, right? When they were running away from like a predator in the savannah, it was good for them to be focused on themselves at that moment, perhaps. But the thing is, when we suffer from chronic stress day after day after day, because we're so hooked on adrenaline and caffeine and all those things, that we have this false belief that stress is important in order to produce, which is also false. But in any case, what it does is it makes us feel less belonging and less transcendent in that moment. And I think that one thing that meditation, but also many other things, like you said, music, or there are so many different ways for us to experience transcendence. What they allow us is through that stress diminishing in our system, it allows for us to actually experience life through a lens that is not narrow, that is not confined, and therefore can lead to, like you say, those noetic experiences that are actually beyond words.
And I think, one of the things I've personally experienced about stress is that it makes having these experiences much more difficult. So if you're trying to sit down to meditate and your mind is kind of running like a train, it's really hard to get into that transcendent space. I don't know, because you've worked so much in practice with meditation, do you have any tips for people how to overcome stress, to kind of find that peaceful center?
Yeah, the truth is life is stressful. Yeah. And so there's nothing we can do about that. It's going to come our way. We're going to deal with hardship, we're going to deal with all these things. But one thing we can do is not add to it, but by leading this very by having this belief that you can only produce and be productive if you're high on adrenaline, which a lot of people believe. And that's why everyone's always like, oh, I'm so tired, I have so much to do, I need to get another coffee, for example, right? But the other thing is, the one thing you can do is become resilient in the face of what is coming at you, is to strengthen your own nervous system. So I've worked with some of the most stressed individuals in our society, which are veterans who came back from Iraq and Afghanistan and who had trauma, which means that they are constantly in fight or flight. Their system is always in a mode of high adrenaline. That's why they can't sleep, they have a hard time focusing, they have a really hard time with relationships. Their life is really difficult. Many of them lived in their basements and just smoked pot all day. That was the only way they could function. And yet, so what we did, we actually used a breathing intervention with them, which sounds really simplistic, but through the breath, you can calm your heart rate and you can calm your blood pressure in minutes. So that's one of the simplest things I can share with you today. And that's something we take completely for granted, and even though it's in our daily expression, so take a deep breath and those kinds of things, we really don't take it seriously, but you can calm yourself down in minutes. With the veterans, we did a whole week-long breathing program, which is very intense and was very effective for their trauma. But even for you, if you just take this one thing away, that you can change your state of mind with your breath. In fact, I'd like to share a story about that. A friend of my husband's he was in charge of a convoy, of a vehicle on a large convoy across Afghanistan. So, and all the vehicles had passed safely in front of him, and then his vehicle went over an IED, which is an improvised explosive device. And there was a loud explosion, and when he looked down, his legs were practically severed below the knee. And in that moment, he remembered a breathing technique that he had read about in a book for officers. And it simply involved, and it was for moments of intense stress, and it involved breathing in for a count of 4, holding for a count of 4, breathing out for a count of 4, and holding for a count of 4. In that moment, by some miracle, he remembered that breathing technique, and because of that, he was able to stay calm enough to do his duty, which was first and foremost check on his men, make sure that they were okay. The second thing he did was give orders, because he was the officer in charge, to call for help. And the third thing he did was tourniquet his own legs, which was wrap them up, and then prop them up. And only when everything was taken care of, at that moment only, did he lose consciousness. And later he was told if he had not done that, he would have bled to death, fallen into a coma. And I've met, Jake's his name, I talked about it in the book, but I've met him, and he came to our wedding. And even though it hurts him to stand in his prosthetics, he danced on the dance floor. And it's just so moving. It was so moving to talk to him. And to me, this story just shows no matter what you go through in life, because we all will go through and do go through difficult times, you have something that can alter your physiology in minutes and give you the presence of mind to save a life, whether it's yours or others, or to say the right thing, or to come up with the right solution. We have that possibility. It really is as simple as breathing. So please look into this. Look into your breath.
That's so powerful. Thanks for sharing that story. Yeah.
Do we have other questions?
So you guys have modeled some really very inspiring stories, so thank you very much. And it's been actually quite, I feel a bit calmer now in my life, so you're doing some good. I wanted to just try a different tack, which is, you've talked about positive ways of behaving. I want to talk about the class clown, and I'm asking for a friend, really. Is there any benefit in irreverent, provocative, or mildly kind of disruptive behavior just to shake things up a little bit? Not necessarily going as far as the new president of the United States, but just, I wonder if you've thought about that, other models of behavior beyond apparently good behavior.
Yeah, I think that anything, I mean, your question kind of makes me think of creativity and inspiration, and how do you get creativity and inspiration. I think anything that challenges the status quo, that kind of make you think in a new way, can help you get to new ideas and be more innovative and be inspired. I certainly know that when I encounter new ideas, that's when I feel the most creative. Yeah, Emma.
I think humor is one of the greatest gifts to mankind.
Yeah.
So thank you if you are a class clown, because I think you are from what you mentioned to me before the class started. But humor is a gift, and if you have it, use it, because you uplift everyone. I have a friend who she sees things around her and they just crack her up. Like, we'll be in the car and she said, "Look at that huge guy on that tiny motorcycle," and she's just, I would never have noticed this person. But just seeing that humor, by seeing the humor, you open everyone's eyes to it, and you uplift everyone, and you tickle everyone. And so I think it's a tremendous gift. It does shake up your thinking, and it can lead to transcendence, because I've been thinking about Louis C.K. and how some of the things he shares are so powerful and transcendent, and yet because of his gift of humor, they reach hundreds of thousands of people, and his videos get shared, right? But he's sharing a very profound point. So I think humor is incredible. I wish I had something.
And I mean, to this point about transcendence, it literally kind of helps you step outside of yourself. When you laugh, or if you're having some kind of trouble and someone can make you smile, that's like, it transforms you.
Okay, hopefully I can ask this succinctly, and Emily, maybe with your background you can help me a little bit. But being somebody who's from a religious background, or upbringing rather, there's been this inherent goodness instilled in my life, and though I may or may not fulfill that particular goodness that I was raised with, I use service in a lot of ways I enjoy doing service, and I enjoy engaging with people in a way that uplifts them and makes them feel better. But I often worry sometimes that I'm doing it in a manner to fulfill that goodness. Is there a way to is there a place to put self-importance that isn't based on that service, if that makes sense?
So, tell me a little bit more.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
This is turning into a therapy session. So I enjoy engaging people, and it's kind of the no good deed goes unpunished kind of mentality, where it's, I don't know, I just in engaging with people, I strive to lift them up, and I worry that my motivations for doing it are based in self-aggradation or self-satisfaction. Oh my gosh, what's the word? Satisfaction.
Yeah.
And not in the act of actually genuinely trying to help somebody else.
I think that at the end of the day, if service is service, and that's kind of putting something into the world that was needed, and I think that, ideally, maybe your motivations should be one thing versus another, but that ultimately we're all flawed, and we all kind of struggle with what motivates us, but that if we're doing something good in the world, then that's a wonderful thing. I mean, what you're saying kind of reminds me of one of the studies that I wrote about in my book, where people told a story of themselves either as being basically a generous person or a person who benefits a lot from the generosity of others. And the people who told the story of themselves as being a generous person ultimately were more generous. So they went out and did more acts of service and were more giving in the workplace, more charitable at home, whatever the case may be. And so I think that what that tells me is that the way that we understand ourselves and how we kind of craft our own identities has real effects for how we live our lives. So if you're trying to kind of make sense of what's motivating you and what kind of person I am, then I would just ask yourself, well, what kind of person do I want to be? Tell that story and then live it in the world.
Hi. I have a little bit of a question about motivation. I am a freelancer, and I have approximately 45,000 jobs, and I guess that by the time that I get to the end of all my kind of survival things and all the things that I do find valuable, I'm left wondering why I'm doing all this stuff and what my motivation is ultimately in more of a creative sense. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how to manage doing all the things that we have to do, doing the things that we want to do.
Do you mind? I have a story that kind of speaks it. What industry do you work in?
I'm a teacher and I'm an actor. And,
Okay. Great.
A lot of childcare, a lot of performance.
I think so. There's two kind of little anecdotes, I guess. So one of them is I interviewed this woman who's a zookeeper, and so zookeepers have a really strong sense of meaning, even though they spend 80% of their time shoveling animal poop from one place to another. But it's all about how they frame their work. So for Ashley, the woman I interviewed, her job wasn't shoveling animal poop from one place to another. It was taking care of the animals and making sure that she was doing everything she could to help them lead kind of good and healthy lives. So to the extent that, teaching and childcare and acting help you fulfill some broader goal, maybe that's contributing creatively to the world in some way, helping, the next generation of young people come up, whatever the case may be, maybe trying to reframe some of the more tedious aspects of what you're doing and the things that are helping you kind of just get by as in service of that larger goal. The other thing is, I think that we often put a lot of pressure on ourselves to find our work tasks meaningful. So, I'm a teacher and I have to find every moment of this meaningful in order for my job to be meaningful and therefore my life to be meaningful. But I think that sometimes these things can help us, they can be valuable and meaningful because they help us with something else. So there was a study of women who were working at a coupon processing factory in Mexico, which is really tedious work. It doesn't, not the kind of thing that screams calling or meaningful work. And yet some of them understood that job as helping them support their family versus others of them just saw it as like a way to make money. And so those of them who had that kind of self-transcendent goal, this goal that involved, something that was valuable to them, were ultimately more kind of productive and purposeful at work. So, in that case, it's not about the job itself being meaningful, it's about it kind of giving you the opportunity to do something else that's meaningful. So that might be another way to reframe it, perhaps.
Thanks for this. Is social media replacing religion in our culture? So when I was a kid, like every Sunday we would go to church, and it seemed to me there was kind of two parts of it. There was the part about spending an hour or two every week thinking about what it is to be a good person, and having coffee and cake and stuff like that. And there was this other part of like, you're supposed to believe that a virgin got pregnant, and someone parted the Red Sea, another guy loaded animals onto a boat and saved the world. And I kind of felt like these two pieces, like it'd be nice to have the first part, and that doesn't really, I know there are Unitarian churches, they seem to not have really taken off too well without the whole dogma part, fire and brimstone part. But I guess I'm just curious, is maybe social media our attempt to find connection to others that establishment religion used to provide in the culture, but maybe it's doing it sort of more amorally, and in that way maybe not as well.
I think social media is interesting because on the one hand, there's a whole lot of junk that you can find on social media. It's also a great escape. A lot of people are just constantly scrolling through it as an escape from whatever's happening. I don't know if you're familiar with that study that nobody likes to sit in a room and do nothing. In this one particular study, participants were told to do that. You come in this study, you get paid for it. Here, please, can you sit in this room and do nothing? If you the only thing you could actually do in this room is electrocute yourself over there, but people prefer to give themselves electric shocks and sit around and do nothing. So that may be another reason why social media is so great, because it's constantly something to do on your phone, no matter what. But so social media gets a bad rap in some ways, but in other ways, it can be profoundly connecting. And I'll tell you one story of a veteran that I know. He runs this Facebook page called Shit My Drill Sergeant Says. It's a military humor page run by about 10 drill sergeants, and they have only just funny kind of things, military humor. And one day he got a message to the page that said, my friend has a gun, he's in an unknown location, we don't know what's going to happen, but we're really afraid he's going to commit suicide. And in that moment, he posted on that page, he said, okay, all jokes are off, this is what's happening, he's somewhere in Baltimore, he's got a gun, his phone is off, we can't locate him. In that night, there were hundreds of comments, people getting in their cars from across states to go to this location. By 4:30 a.m., he had been found, his life was saved. And the next day, they posted the voicemail that he left, which was so moving. I mean, it just moved me to tears. Just say thank you for, basically saving my life. So I think social media can also be a profound place for human connection, profound place for us to share really uplifting things. So we can also ask yourself, how do I use social media? Because I can use it to affect a profound social good. Let's say you're too busy. I'm too busy with my family, my life, my work. What can I do? Well, you can use your social media to share things. For example, how many of you saw this week that article about the LA Times article about the foster parent in LA who only fosters kids who are about to die? Did you see that article? Was it amazing? Amazing article. If you haven't seen it, you should read it. I mean, I cannot forget that article. The guy is amazing. So, but those kind of articles, I read that article and I thought, this is a human being who is living as a fully blossomed human being with full meaning, full heart. Like, wow, this is what I think is an elite person who has completely blossomed in his heart. But those kind of things, those are the ways that we can use social media to, yes, bring about greater values, make people think, feel in ways that are profound and transcendent and meaningful.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. I've been to a few of these cocktails and conversations, and this is one that's really got me thinking in a big way. One of the things that keeps coming up is I get meaning of life and wanting to understand. But the underlying thing is, if we all as individuals learn how to ask a question and learn how to ask for help, as individuals in an ecosystem, then you know how to deliver and then hence have meaning of life. Why is it so difficult for individuals to ask for help? We can all ask Google for help, right? We'll search and I worked for Google for 8 years. But what is it that makes it so difficult for us as humans to state what's going on in our lives, to ask for help so that somebody else can provide and have that meaningfulness in their life to provide?
I think that asking for help requires a lot of vulnerability, which is really hard for a lot of people. I was talking to a woman yesterday who's worked in all kinds of corporations at a high level, and we were talking about how do you create kind of cultures of meaning in these institutions. And we happen to be talking about belonging more, and she was telling me about how if the leader can just kind of get people to make eye contact with each other when they walk past each other in the hallway and smile, that will go a long way. But the reason so many people don't is because they're afraid. Because what if you make eye contact and smile and the other person doesn't, and then you've been rejected? And that's just a small example. You can think of bigger examples, like you ask for help and someone kind of judges you for being weak or insufficient, or especially in like a work context. So I think that we have the fear of vulnerability, and I think that the only way to get over it, really, or one of the only ways, is to realize that we all share that fear, and that we're all kind of waiting for that person that we're interacting with to reach out and to show themselves to be vulnerable before we can take that step ourselves. So I would say just role modeling it ourselves is probably a way that we can get there.
I definitely concur. Authenticity, it takes so much courage to show those tears if they're there, to show that fear if it's there, to show that love if it's there, show that enthusiasm. Because, gosh, who knows what people are going to think. But if you're around someone who's really authentic, that person who's kind of goofy or maybe the class clown, that person is so likable, right? And you can feel so comfortable around them. Why? Because they're being themselves. And yeah, so maybe they're a little goofy. It doesn't matter because you feel like you can be yourself around that person. So I completely agree. Authenticity and going out there. And sometimes people will reject your emotions because it makes them uncomfortable. That's fine. It makes them uncomfortable. But some people will breathe a sigh of relief, and then you will really connect. So I completely agree about that.
Maybe one more question before we wrap up? No? Anyone? Oh, I got one more. Josh, always good for a question.
So I have a deep curiosity about the mind's ability to transcend its physiology and go beyond improbability and quantum leap into the possibilities. We're constantly transcending ourselves in biological terms and even in philosophy, right? So I wanted to go back to your friend Jake, actually. And I wanted to go back to that moment, that miraculous moment, and ask, or just wonder why or how he remembered that place in the instruction manual. How? Completely improbable.
I think there's some questions where there's no answer, there's just a wonder. And that wonder is what there are so many more questions in our lives than answers, and we know some of the science, and we also know science knows hardly anything about us anyway. There's so much to wonder about, and I think that's a lot of what transcendence is about, and it's a lot about leading us into that, like you said, that deep curiosity about what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to live this life? What does it mean to transcend? Why is it that these miracles happen sometimes in our minds, in our lives? Or why is it that we get swept up in this current of emotion that's meaningless, 5 years later? So those are questions that psychology hasn't even begun to answer. But those are questions that I think can really lead us to deeper levels of self-reflection.
Emma and I were talking before this Q&A about kind of our shared love of the humanities and religion and spirituality, and I think we both agree, and tell me if I'm wrong, that we both love psychology and we write about what we write about from the perspective of social science research, but that also I don't think psychology has really improved on what the great wisdom of the past has had to say about these matters of what it means to be human, that there's so much depth there that maybe the humanities are better at helping us figure out than what goes on in a science lab.
To be continued.
Hooray!
Yeah. So